The grass stretches farther than the eye can see, soft and golden like an ocean without water. It ripples gently under the breath of the wind as if remembering footsteps long since vanished. There are no fences here, no roads, no signs that anything has ever tried to tame this place. Only the wind, the river, and the open sky. This is Montana, before the memory of war, before thunderclouds of hooves and gunpowder, before anyone named the hills after men who would die upon them. This land knew silence long before it knew sound, and it kept secrets long before it kept scars. The Little Bighorn River curls through the plains like a ribbon of glimmering thought. Narrow and quiet, it doesn't roar or rush, it wanders. It hums against its own banks, carrying stories without words. On a summer day, you could mistake it for something harmless. But rivers have long memories. They remember every drop of blood, every horse that drank its water before falling, every man who crossed its shallows and never returned. The sky here never seems to end. It doesn't press down like the skies of cities or forests. It lifts, it pulls the gaze upward. The clouds drift in long, slow arcs like they too are heading towards something unseen. You might lie down in the grass and forget the world ever had such things as borders or battles. The horizon stretches without interruption. No army here, not yet. But something stirs beneath the surface, not in the soil or the sky, but in time itself. Something coming, something gathering. The ridges are soft now. They cradle birdsong. The hills do not yet bear names like Last Stand. There are no monuments here, no markers, no tourists with maps and bottled water, just grass, waving gently, as if welcoming ghosts who haven't yet arrived. Beneath that grass lies the heartbeat of 1,000 years, bones of antelope, hoofprints of buffalo, scattered flakes of stone where hands once shaped arrows by moonlight. This land was never empty. It only seemed that way to those who came looking for maps instead of meaning. There were people here, whole nations, living not in towns but in movement, people who followed the rhythm of the earth instead of the ticking of clocks. Their calendars were the stars. Their time was measured by migrations and sunrises, not by treaties or telegraphs. The Lakota called this land part of their sacred web. The Cheyenne knew its grasses and slopes like old friends. The Arapaho told stories that traced the curves of the rivers as if the water itself had a voice. And it did. It still does. For them, the land was alive. It wasn't a resource, it wasn't real estate, it was breath and spirit and blood. Every hill had a song, every trail had a memory, and the Little Bighorn, though it had no clock, no cannon, no name in a history book, was a place of deep knowing. But the earth can feel when things are about to change, and if you listened closely, you might have heard it in the rustling of the grass. Not fear, not exactly, but a kind of sorrow. Like the land already knew what was coming. There were boots being polished hundreds of miles away, horses being saddled, flags folded and carried in wagons. The language of orders and rank, maps drawn in offices by men who had never walked this soil, men who saw this place not as sacred, but as strategy. But out here, far from Washington, far from Fort Abraham Lincoln, far from the lines drawn in ink on treaty paper, the land still held its breath. It hadn't yet been split into winners and losers, into brave and foolish, into cavalry and warrior. There was only wind, only time, only quiet. The ground had not yet been torn by bullets. The birds still nested undisturbed. The cottonwoods along the river swayed gently, unaware of what they would one day witness. And the river flowed, as rivers always do, indifferent to what waits on its banks. You could walk this land and feel nothing but peace. You could dip your hand in the Little Bighorn and feel only coolness, not blood. You could climb the hills and hear only wind, not the echo of rifles or the shouts of men dying far from home. You could believe for just a moment that nothing could ever change this. But change does not ask for permission. It doesn't knock. It rides in hard and fast with dust rising behind it. Somewhere beyond the hills, soldiers are moving. Somewhere further still, a campfire glows under a starlit sky, where elders speak softly of visions and danger. But here, in this moment, before any of that, the land is still untouched. It won't stay that way. The horses are coming, the scouts are already watching. The morning light will one day reveal more than just grass and sky. It will reveal fate, drawn out in lines of cavalry and rings of warriors. It will reveal names, Custer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, but for now, those names are not yet written in this soil. This is the pause before the song begins, the first breath before the first drum beat. You can almost feel the tension, not loud, not sharp, but deep, like the weight of storm clouds not yet seen. In this quiet, there is dignity, the kind that comes before ruin, a stillness full of meaning like the last unbroken surface of a pond before the stone is thrown. This chapter of history hasn't started yet. The ink hasn't touched the page, the grass still stands tall, the hills still rest without knowing what they'll hold, the river still flows as it always has, carrying not just water but the shape of what is coming. Sleep now, let the wind lull you, let the silence speak, because once the thunder arrives, there will be no room for quiet. Not for many years. Before they were called warriors, they were just people. Moving with the seasons, gathering beneath wide skies, living by the rhythm of the earth. They did not need borders to define them, or written laws to bind them. The Great Plains were enough, the wind, the stars, the hunt. That was their way. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. They lived where the sky was endless and the land seemed to breathe. This was not wilderness to them. This was home. Every river had a purpose. Every stone had a memory. The prairie grasses bowed gently as they passed, as if recognizing old friends. Here children laughed beside the fire. Elders told stories long after the stars had risen, and the bison, millions of them, roamed freely, their hooves beating a pulse into the soil that kept time with all who walked this land. The hunt was not just survival. It was ceremony. It was honor. Men rode for miles in silence, their eyes scanning the horizon, their spirits steady and sharp. When the bison fell, it was with reverence. Nothing wasted, nothing taken without thanks. Bones carved into tools, hide turned into shelter, meat shared across the camp. And when the fires were lit, there were songs, soft, steady, sacred. Families moved not by calendar, but by instinct. When the grass grew tall and the rivers swelled, they followed. When the cold set in, they gathered closer. Villages came and went like echoes, appearing one season, gone the next, leaving behind only faint impressions in the grass. But memory lived on, in children, in stories, in stars. The Black Hills rose to the west like a crown on the horizon. Sacred, timeless, untouchable. They were not just a place. They were the center of the world, where the spirits spoke, where ancestors walked, where prayers rose like smoke and disappeared into sky. No coin could ever measure their worth. No treaty could truly own them. Sitting Bull, a man of visions, walked those hills. He carried more than just leadership. He carried memory. When he fasted, when he danced, he did so not just for himself, but for his people, for their future, for what he could feel coming. He saw further than most, not with his eyes, but with something deeper. And there was Crazy Horse, quiet, watchful, a man who needed no speeches, who spoke in actions, who rode into danger without hesitation and melted into the land like a shadow. He was not driven by hatred, but by something older, a duty, a promise, an unshakable love for the way things had been before soldiers came. Gaul stood tall beside them, sharp mind, sharp memory. His strength not just in battle, but in decision. He remembered who had broken which promise, who had burned which village. His loyalty did not waver, and his voice did not tremble. He was a shield for those who could not defend themselves. Together they did not form a government. They formed something stronger, trust, not ruled by titles but by respect, not by laws, but by understanding. They did not need to speak for hours to reach a decision. Their hearts knew the path. When they gathered, it was not to plan war, but to listen, to dream, to remember. Around the fires, elders spoke of the beginning of all things, of the first people, of sacred animals and songs sung before humans walked. Children sat wide-eyed, learning not just the past, but how to carry it forward. They learned the Sundance not as performance, but as offering. It was not something done for spectators. It was done for the spirits, for the people, for balance. Through pain came clarity. Through sacrifice, connection. The circle, the drum, the breath of the dancers. These were things that kept the world in harmony. But as the seasons turned, unease began to settle across the camps. It didn't happen all at once. At first, just a few white men crossing the edge of the horizon. Then more, then roads, then forts. Wagons rolled across trails once carved by animals. Telegraph poles rose like broken trees. The sound of axes, the smell of gunpowder, the clink of shovels searching for gold. The soldiers came wearing blue. They came with flags and orders and papers with unfamiliar names. They brought railroads and rifles, and they spoke of boundaries, though none were visible in the grass. They measured the land not by spirit, but by acre. And when they spoke of ownership, it was as if no one had ever lived here at all. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho did not meet them with immediate fear, but they watched, they waited. They asked questions of the land and of the stars. They sent scouts not to fight, but to understand. Then came the talks, the meetings under tents, the shaking of hands, the trading of promises. But promises faded faster than footprints. The land that was supposed to be kept sacred was marked for survey. The rivers they drank from were now borders, and the Black Hills, sacred above all, were under threat. Tensions simmered like coals beneath the snow. No single moment sparked the fire. It was slow, heavy, inevitable. Children began to hear more stories about soldiers than about spirits. Women began storing food for what might come. Warriors rode farther, stayed out longer. The drums still beat, the dances still rose. But the questions were growing louder. Would the land remain theirs? Would the bison return next spring? Would the treaties mean anything at all? Still, they held on to their ways, not because of stubbornness, but because of faith, because the stars still moved across the sky in familiar arcs, because the grass still grew each year, because the wind still whispered the same names. But the air had shifted. And far beyond the horizon, men in uniforms were studying maps. In a camp near the Missouri, a general was planning movement. In Washington, voices debated how best to remove hostiles. In forts, orders were sharpened like bayonets. None of them knew the songs of this land. None of them heard the drums. None of them had ever stood on a hill at dawn and felt the silence of the plains. Yet they were coming. And the people of sky and earth, those who had danced before they had fought, could feel it in their bones. The sun still rose. The children still laughed, but beneath it all the land was holding its breath. Something was coming, and it would not ask to enter. It didn't begin with cannon fire. It didn't begin with the sound of rifles cracking across the plains. It began quieter than that, with men in suits signing papers in rooms far from the dust, with miners whispering of gold, deep in the heart of sacred land, with promises made in ink, then crumpled and forgotten in drawers. The Great Sioux War of 1876 began not with fury, but with a decision to chase gold, no matter the cost. The Black Hills had been a mystery to most who weren't born beneath them, but to the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, they were a heartbeat, a place of prayer, a place never meant to be sold or sliced or stolen. But gold changes things, it always has. When it was discovered in those hills, it spread fast. Whispers turned to caravans. Adventurers became trespassers. Prospectors built tents, then cabins, then settlements like mushrooms blooming overnight where they weren't welcome. And all of it happened in defiance of what had been promised. The U.S. government had sworn the land was theirs, a treaty, they said, a boundary, they claimed, but paper meant little in the face of gold. The pressure built quickly. Washington couldn't or wouldn't stop the tide, so instead, it shifted the blame. An ultimatum was delivered. The tribes must relocate, leave their ancestral grounds, come to the reservation by a certain date, or be considered hostile. There was no room for negotiation, no allowance for weather, no ear for tradition, migration, or ceremony, just a deadline, set by men who had never felt the weight of winter on the open plains. And so, the march to war began, not as a single clash, but as a slow tightening of a noose. The U.S. military didn't rely on one force, they came from three sides, like jaws closing around a prey that hadn't asked for this fight. From the south, General Crook; from the west, Colonel Gibbon; and from the east, General Alfred Terry, whose column carried the man who would become a legend for all the wrong reasons, George Armstrong Custer. He was a man who believed in destiny. He wore his confidence like a second uniform, long golden hair, polished boots, a name that echoed from his time in the Civil War like it still meant something here, on the open prairie. Custer and the 7th Cavalry rode with a sense of purpose that didn't leave room for doubt. They were soldiers, yes, but also explorers, enforcers, invaders, depending on who you asked. They pushed west with maps and orders and bugles, moving through a land that did not belong to them, but which they meant to claim anyway. It was summer. The sun hung high and hot over the plains. The rivers swelled with snowmelt. Grass waved in great unbroken seas, and beneath it all, the ground remembered old footsteps, remembered battles from long ago, remembered things the soldiers didn't know to fear. The campaign was meant to be swift, overwhelming, the kind of display that would force submission. But the land had other ideas. Storms rolled in, supplies ran low, and the people they sought, those labeled as hostiles, knew this terrain far better than any map could show. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were not idle. They were watching, listening, moving. They were not a scattered rabble, as the army had once believed. They were families, warriors, elders, brought together by something more powerful than any military command: survival. Their scouts moved like smoke. Their villages could vanish with the sunrise. They saw the columns coming before the columns knew where they were going. Still the soldiers pressed on, camp by camp, river by river. The plan was simple: pin the tribes between the three advancing forces, drive them inward, box them in, and then finish it. But war doesn't follow plans. It doesn't obey orders written on paper. It finds its own rhythm. And in the hills and valleys of what is now southeastern Montana, the rhythm was changing. Custer had grown impatient. He wanted glory, wanted a victory of his own. He didn't want to wait for the other columns. He didn't want to share credit. And so he pushed forward, fast, light, uncoordinated. The 7th Cavalry moved with speed but without understanding, into a land where every bend in the river, every rise in the ground held stories they hadn't heard. Every sound could be a warning, every shadow a signal. But they rode anyway. A nation was in motion, and so was fate. Tens of thousands of bison were gone, replaced now by wagons and wire. Rivers once clear ran with silt. Traditions were being silenced with every passing year, and the people of the plains, those labeled the enemy, had no choice but to gather. A great camp had formed along the Little Bighorn River. Not a war camp, a village, a living, breathing, moving testament to a people not yet defeated. Thousands of men, women, and children, horses tethered in the grass, fires burning, stories shared, songs still sung. It was there that two paths would meet, one by design, the other by chance. Custer rode toward it without knowing its size, without knowing who waited there. He had reports, of course, scouts, warnings, but he believed in his own eyes more than anyone else's, believed his speed would give him advantage, believed fortune would favor boldness. The trap was already set, but not by generals, by time, by arrogance, by misunderstanding, by the land itself. In those final days of June, the prairie held its breath. A column of cavalry advanced under a sky that had seen too much. A great village waited with every heart beating in unison, not with fear, but with resolve. And somewhere between them, destiny rode quietly, unseen. Not a roar, not yet. Just footsteps. And the long, slow exhale of history as everything prepared to change. It always begins with words. Words written in ink, declared with ceremony. Words spoken as if they carry the weight of forever. But on the plains, forever has always been fragile. In 1868, a promise was made. At Fort Laramie, soldiers, government agents, and Lakota leaders met beneath a tent of negotiations and fear. The land was tired, the people more so. So a treaty was signed, lines drawn across a living map. The United States promised to leave the Black Hills to the Lakota. No settlers, no forts, no roads without consent. In return, peace. A fragile agreement between two nations who neither trusted nor understood one another. For a time the treaty held. The Black Hills stood quiet. The bison roamed. The Lakota people moved with the seasons, following the great herds, raising their children in lands their ancestors had called home for generations. But treaties, like fences, are only respected until someone decides they're inconvenient. And somewhere in the mountains, hidden beneath pine and rock and sacred ground, gold was waiting to be found. It wasn't the Lakota who came looking for it. It was miners, white men with pickaxes and dreams. Rumors traveled fast. Gold in the Black Hills, they said. Riches beyond measure, just sitting there for the taking. And the hills, sacred and still, became a destination for greed. At first they trickled in quietly, a few prospectors sneaking across the treaty line, then more with wagons and shovels, building camps and carving trails where none were meant to be. The government watched, knew what the treaty said. But gold has a way of making men forget their promises. The Lakota saw it all. The sacred places defiled, the mountains, once sanctuaries, now echoing with the clang of tools and the voices of trespassers. They appealed to Washington, spoke with the words of law and spirit, but the answers came slowly, and when they came, they rang hollow. The U.S. government had a choice: enforce the treaty or follow the gold. It chose the gold. Negotiators arrived with proposals. Sell the Black Hills, they said. Name a price. Turn over the land in exchange for rations, tools, and boundaries drawn tighter still. But the Black Hills weren't for sale. They weren't just hills. They were where the earth spoke, where visions came, where generations were buried. Selling them would be like selling the heart out of your chest. So the Lakota said no. That refusal, grounded in spirit and memory, was taken by the government as defiance. A peaceful act, holding to a treaty that had not yet expired, was labeled aggression, and with that label, a new narrative took shape. They called them hostiles now, not defenders, not keepers of the land, hostiles, a word that makes it easier to send soldiers, easier to forget the promises made. The Fort Laramie Treaty, once held up as a pact between equals, was now just a paper with signatures, and signatures fade. The Black Hills were flooded with miners. The army arrived not to stop them, but to protect them. Roads were built even as tribal leaders protested. The treaty's words, so carefully crafted years before, were ignored, buried under new maps and louder voices. In the East, in offices filled with maps and clocks, the story changed. Reports painted the Lakota and Cheyenne as obstacles, as threats. The context was lost. The broken promises never mentioned, only resistance. And yet resistance came. Not with hate, not even with vengeance, but with resolve. To stay, to hold the land not as a possession, but as a responsibility. It was more than the Black Hills. It was the erosion of every promise that had come before. This treaty was only the latest in a long line. Each one made, then bent, then broken. Each time land taken, each time peace promised and stolen. The treaties were no longer sacred. They were tools, temporary conveniences. And when they stopped being useful, they were discarded like old plans, folded and forgotten in drawers. But the Lakota remembered. They remembered the meetings, the handshakes, the signatures. They remembered the lines drawn in the dirt. And they remembered what was said, how long the peace would last, how both sides had agreed. Now those same promises were treated as obstacles. What had once been an agreement now became a justification for war. The same treaty that had promised peace was being twisted into an excuse for violence because one side had kept to its word while the other had walked away. The Black Hills became more than sacred. They became a symbol, a line that would not be crossed without consequence. Families gathered closer. Elders spoke of past betrayals. Warriors sharpened their resolve. They did not want war, but they would not surrender their home to the hunger of men who saw nothing but gold. And while the government sent soldiers, the people of the plains sent prayers. They held their ceremonies, they painted their faces, they watched the smoke on the horizon and listened for the sound of hooves. Somewhere in all this, the meaning of the treaty was lost to history. It became less a promise and more a memory. The kind of memory that carries sorrow, that echoes in the quiet between battles. That remains even when the words are gone. Because once a treaty is broken, it cannot be unbroken. It becomes something else. A scar on the land, a silence between generations, a shadow on the page of history that never fully disappears. And as soldiers moved west and the hills filled with strangers, that shadow only grew. Peace had been offered, not just once but many times, and each time it was set aflame. Treaties reduced to ashes, ashes carried by the wind that still moves across the plains as if trying to whisper the words back into place. But the paper is gone, the trust is gone, and all that's left is the land itself holding the memory tight, refusing to forget. They came not for war, but for life. Across the sweeping plains, through open hills and sunburned valleys they moved. Families, hunters, grandmothers, infants, the old and the bold. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho. Separate peoples with shared blood, all converging like rivers to a single point, the Little Bighorn. There was no rallying cry, no drums of war beating in the distance, just a quiet momentum. Word had traveled from camp to camp, whispers of threat, rumors of soldiers, and the smell of danger drifting in from the east. And yet what drew them together wasn't vengeance or violence. It was breath. It was life. A need to be together as they once were, without borders, without fences, without the ticking clock of someone else's deadline. The Little Bighorn Valley bloomed with people. Teepees dotted the grasslands like stars falling to earth. Horses grazed nearby in great herds, kicking up soft clouds of dust as children ran between them laughing. Women knelt by the river's edge, washing hides and filling bowls. Smoke rose from hundreds of cook fires, curling upward like fingers of prayer. This was a village, the largest some had ever seen, not a war camp, not a base, a home. Inside the circle of life, time slowed. Boys learned to ride. Girls learned to bead. Elders told stories of winters long past, and the young listened with wide eyes. Laughter echoed. Dances were danced. Lives were lived. It was a moment suspended, something that felt untouched by the crawling shadow just beyond the hills. Still, that shadow grew. Everyone knew it. In the center of it all stood Sitting Bull. A leader, yes, but also something more. A man shaped by visions, carved by loss, and held upright by an unshakable belief in the sacred. He did not move through the camp like a chief issuing orders. He moved like a flame, quiet and steady, drawing people not with power, but with gravity. The Sundance began. The sacred ceremony was not a spectacle. It was a surrender, of flesh, of pain, of self. It was not meant to entertain or impress. It was meant to reach beyond, to touch something larger than skin and blood. In the center of the circle, beneath the watchful eyes of sky and spirit, Sitting Bull danced. He danced without rest. He danced until the earth began to blow beneath him, until the pain became prayer, until his body fell. And in the silence after, a vision came. The soldiers falling, not marching, not riding, not shooting, falling like leaves from a shaken tree. They came and then they broke. When Sitting Bull awoke, he carried the vision like a stone in his chest, heavy, certain. The future was coming, but it had not arrived, not yet. Word spread, not as fear, but as clarity. This place, this village by the river, it would not remain untouched. The land had been chosen not just by the people, but by something greater, something that seemed to know what was coming. But still, there was no panic, no fleeing. The people stayed. This was not defiance, it was dignity. To live as they had always lived, together, open, free. War might come, but it would not find them hiding. Children continued to play, weaving between tall grass and the legs of horses. Mothers held babies against their shoulders and hummed songs older than memory. Men hunted and prepared. Scouts rode out, then returned with sightings of soldiers in the distance, always closer, always more. Still, the fires burned. Still, the river sang. Even the animals seemed to know something was changing. Birds took strange routes. Horses stirred at night. The dogs barked at wind that carried a sharper scent than usual. There was no call to arms, only a call to stay awake. The great village pulsed like a living heart. Teepees swayed in the breeze. The people moved with purpose, not panic. Each one knew what might happen, but fear was not in control. They were not criminals, not fugitives. They were families, gathered in the last place where breath still felt free. Some nights, drums echoed through the dark, not for battle, but for prayer. Other nights, only silence answered the stars. The river became a mirror. Horses drank from it. Children dipped their fingers in it. Warriors studied their own reflections in it, wondering if this was the last peace they'd ever see. The tension was not spoken. It did not need to be. It was felt in glances. In the way a man sharpened his knife a little longer. In how a mother held her child a little tighter. In the quiet way elders stared at the horizon before returning to their stories. Then came the early morning light. The kind of light that feels new but carries something ancient. Somewhere beyond the hills, men in blue marched. Soldiers with rifles and orders. They believed they were hunting enemies. They were riding toward what they thought was a target. But what waited for them was a village, a people, a way of life they could not understand. There were no fortifications here, no bunkers, no flags waving above trenches, only teepees, only families, only the last breath of an old world that refused to vanish quietly. What was coming was not yet written, but it had already been seen, in a vision, in a dream, in a dance beneath the sun. The people at Greasy Grass did not wake up that morning to fight. They woke up to cook, to laugh, to wash, to teach, to live. That was their resistance, that was their strength. Not war cries, but lullabies. Not uniforms, but stories. Not conquest, but continuity. The gathering was not a preparation for battle. It was a reclamation of existence. And as the cavalry closed in, the wind shifted, as if the earth itself was drawing a breath, waiting for what came next. The sun had barely broken the horizon. It came slow, like a whisper, like a secret about to be told. Light spilled over the ridgelines in gold, brushing the grass, waking the earth. June 25th, 1876. Just another morning to some, but not to the wind, not to the sky, not to the land that had been waiting, watching, holding its breath for centuries. East of the Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry moved. Saddles creaked, boots nudged flanks. The columns stretched forward, cutting through sagebrush and dust like a blade unsheathed. They had ridden for days, tired, wired, half-fed and heat-washed. The men didn't know what they were about to ride into. Most never would. At their head was a man chasing glory like it was something owed to him. General George Armstrong Custer. Blue uniform, gold braid, eyes sharp, jaw set. He was not the largest man on the field, but he moved like a man who had already seen the ending, who believed it would end the way it always had, with him standing tall and the enemy scattered. His scouts rode ahead, creeping over ridges, peering through spyglasses. What they saw made hearts thump faster, the village, the size of it. A sweep of white teepees stretching along the river like snow that had melted and decided to stay. But they misread it. Maybe the angle fooled them. Maybe the distance. Or maybe they just didn't believe it was possible. They thought they found a target. Not a gathering. Not a nation. Not the largest native encampment any of them had ever seen. Still, Custer made the call. No pause. No conference. Just a decision. Dropped like a stone in a river. The waters would ripple soon enough. He would split the force. 3 prongs, 3 angles, 3 directions of pressure. Major Reno would lead the first strike, a direct charge down into the southern edge of the village. Custer himself would sweep from the north, flanking, surprising, breaking their spine. Benteen would trail far left, scouting and reinforcing. It was a tactic made for a smaller enemy, an overconfident charge with blind corners. The problem wasn't the plan. The problem was the assumption behind it, that the people in that village would run, that they would break, that they weren't ready, that they weren't watching. But they were. Back at the river, the camp was stirring. The smoke from morning fires rose slowly into the pale blue sky. Children chased each other between teepees. Mothers bent over cooking pots. Men sat cross-legged, sharpening knives, braiding hair, talking about the hunt. For a moment, it was still just a morning. A sacred morning. A quiet before history thundered in. Back on the ridge, Custer scanned the valley. His men readied their rifles. The bugles stayed silent for now. The grass swayed gently around them, and the sun kept rising. But something about the air had changed, like it had stiffened, tightened, as if the world knew this moment had weight. Dust began to lift behind Reno's column. The first movement, the first thread pulled from the edge of the day. They dropped down through ravines, through shadow, into the wide basin where life was unfolding by the river. At first, those in the village didn't understand. Horses? Yes, but not from their own scouts. Then the smoke, then the sound, then the shape of charging men dressed in blue coming fast across the plain. The alarm spread fast like fire. Mothers grabbed children. Boys ran for weapons. Dogs barked and stampeded away from the approaching threat. Some women fled toward the trees. Some stayed. Some picked up knives and hatchets and stood their ground. Warriors surged into motion. Not with panic, with purpose. They had prepared for this moment, whether they knew it or not. The gathering had never been just about peace. It had been about presence. This land was theirs. That river was theirs. Their children played on this soil. Their ancestors were buried beneath it. To leave would be to surrender something sacred. They chose not to. Reno's men hit hard, but the resistance was sharper than expected. Warriors fired back from the brush, circled around on horseback, struck from directions Reno couldn't see. The charge stalled. Confusion spread. Up north, Custer watched unfold, but not for long. He was already moving. already diving toward the upper edge of the village, unaware that the whole shape of the land had changed. What had once looked like a retreating village was now becoming a coiled force, a gathering that had turned toward the wind, ready to strike. Custer still thought he could split the fight in half, but the village wasn't cracking. It was closing in. Somewhere near the river, a child dropped her doll and turned toward the noise. A warrior pulled on a war shirt with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from memory. He had worn this before. He had stood between life and death before. This was no different. Back on the hills, dust billowed around horses' hooves. The wind changed direction. Insects swirled in the sudden heat. Birds took flight from the trees as if the world itself was trying to get out of the way. The two lines of time were about to meet. The 7th Cavalry riding toward what they believed was control. The people of the village standing in the mouth of history, refusing to move. And between them, nothing now. No barrier, no misunderstanding left. Only seconds, only breath. The men under Custer adjusted their rifles, checked their ammunition. Some wiped sweat from their brows, some muttered silent prayers, some simply stared into the haze, looking for shapes in the dust. They didn't know how many were waiting. They didn't know the terrain had betrayed them. They didn't know this battle had already chosen its shape. Back in the village, a boy was handed a small bow. He looked up to his father, who nodded once, not as command, as inheritance. The village was not frozen. It was awake, fully, and soon it would move. Reno's line was already falling back, bending under the pressure, but Custer didn't see it, or didn't believe it, or couldn't afford to turn back now. He led his men up the ridges, toward the bluffs, toward the last stand they didn't yet know was coming. Behind him, the dust rose higher. The ground grew hotter, and time slipped forward, unforgiving. Not a single shot had been fired yet in Custer's charge. But the rifles were ready. The war cries were forming, and the weight of centuries was gathering behind every second that remained. The morning before history would not stay a morning for long. It began like thunder trying to sneak in on tiptoe. Reno's column dropped into the valley just after noon, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the heat like smoke. Men shifted in their saddles, rifles slung across shoulders, eyes squinting through the haze. They had been told this was the moment. Strike hard, strike fast, catch them before they could flee. It was supposed to be over quickly. But war doesn't move on timetables, and this one had already started writing itself differently. Reno's men crested the slope and began their charge, hooves pounding across the tall grass, the air growing tight around them. Ahead, the edge of the village shimmered in the sun, deceptively quiet. Teepees stood like white sentinels. Dogs barked in the distance. For a split second, it almost looked easy. Then the village moved. Not away, not in retreat, but toward them. The warriors rose not like scattered prey, but like a storm lifting itself off the earth. One moment there was grass. The next, there were horsemen. Dozens, then hundreds. Feathers trailing behind them, rifles flashing in the light, war paint bright and unshaken. They came out like a flood, fast and everywhere. Reno's line hesitated. Some fired early, wildly. The shots cracked through the valley, splintering the moment. A few horses bolted. Some riders leaned low, urging their mounts forward, trying to keep the shape of the charge, but the line was already breaking at the seams. From the village, the resistance surged with force that shocked even those who thought they were ready. These weren't pockets of resistance, they were waves, organized chaos. Warriors circling in from the flanks, firing from the willows, galloping straight through gaps in Reno's line. And Reno didn't hold. He didn't regroup. He didn't press forward. He pulled back. Abruptly, without clear order, the front collapsed inward. Reno veered into the cottonwood forest near the river. His men followed, some still firing, some simply trying to stay alive. The timber gave them shade, but not safety. It was thick, tangled, and humid. The horses stumbled over roots and mud. Branches whipped at their faces. There was no time to form a proper defense, just frantic motion. Trees became cover, then cages, rifle barrels flashed between trunks. Warriors on foot ducked and weaved, moving like ghosts through the undergrowth. The forest turned into a trap. A killing field. Blood darkened the roots. Reno's men fired blindly into the brush, hoping to buy seconds. Some climbed off their horses, looking for trees to brace against. Others couldn't dismount fast enough. Panic set in fast, sharp and contagious. A lieutenant took a shot to the neck and dropped without a sound. Another man tried to reload behind a fallen log but never got the chance. Screams tangled with the gunfire. And all around them the enemy kept moving, never in one place, never staying still. From the trees to the grass, from the shadows to the water's edge, they fought like they knew the land would protect them. Because it did. Reno tried to rally, calling for order, trying to form a line inside the timber. But the line didn't exist anymore. It had melted, scattered, dissolved into individual survival. The only path left was up. To the bluffs. To the ridges above the valley where the land opened and maybe, just maybe, someone was coming. Maybe Custer, maybe Benteen, maybe rescue, or maybe just distance from the carnage behind them. The retreat was desperate. There was no formation, no rear guard, just men scrambling, wounded and disoriented, clawing their way through thickets and ravines, some on foot, some dragging others behind. They left bodies in the trees, rifles lost in the mud, horses collapsing in exhaustion or pierced mid-gallop. Up the slopes they went, bleeding, coughing, soaked with sweat and smoke. The bluffs weren't high, but they felt like mountains. Each step cost something. Behind them, the forest still echoed with gunfire, but the sounds were thinning now. Fewer shots, fewer voices. And then, silence. A deadly kind. The kind that comes when nothing is left moving below. At the top of the ridge, they collapsed in clusters. Some vomited from the sprint. Some just stared, eyes empty, hands shaking. Blood drying on shirts that had once been blue and now were just dark. There were fewer of them now. Much fewer. They looked back down the slope toward the timberline. Smoke rose from where the forest had swallowed their charge. Teepees still stood beyond it, untouched, watching. There was no pursuit yet, but that didn't mean it was over. Reno paced the edge of the ridge, shouting fragmented orders, eyes darting across the horizon, but inside, he was unraveling. He knew it. His men knew it. He had been the first to strike, and now he was the first to bleed, the first to shatter. The bluffs gave them a pause, not safety. A place to breathe, not to recover. They didn't know where Custer was. They didn't know if Benteen was coming. They didn't even know how many hours had passed. All they knew was that the village below had not fled. The warriors had not broken, and the land was not theirs. Far across the ridges, distant figures were moving now. Scouts, riders, shapes too far to name. The next wave might come from any side. The survivors on the bluff tightened ranks, what was left of them. A few dug shallow rifle pits with bayonets and boot heels. Some simply laid flat, hoping the next strike wouldn't come soon or wouldn't come at all. The sun had shifted overhead, but no one noticed. Time didn't move the same way anymore. It was thicker now, slow and sticky. The dead below had no clocks. The living didn't need them. From the trees, the sounds of crows began to rise. The valley was quiet now, but the land remembered. Every broken branch, every spilled drop of blood. The forest, once a place of cover, was now a grave. Reno sat apart for a moment, near the edge. Hands folded, eyes blank. A man who had charged into legend and stumbled into disaster. Behind him, the wounded moaned. In front of him, the land waited. Because the fight wasn't over, not even close. Custer was still out there, and soon the bluffs would echo again.
The sun was high, but the shadows were longer now. Up on the ridgeline there was no wind, no movement, just silence that pressed down like a weight. The bluffs held men who had already seen too much, faces streaked with dirt, hands trembling around rifles, eyes scanning every horizon hoping for something they couldn't name. And then dust. Not from below, from the west. Hooves, uniforms, help. Captain Benteen arrived not as a storm, but as a question mark. His column rode in with caution, their pace measured, unaware of what waited over the rise. They had seen the smoke, heard distant cracks of rifle fire, but still didn't grasp what had unfolded in the valley below. They didn't expect the wreckage they were about to meet. Reno's survivors didn't cheer. There was no strength left for celebration. Instead, men staggered toward Benteen's company, like they'd just come out of the earth itself. Dirty, bloodied, shell-shocked. Some were missing boots. Others didn't speak, just pointed back toward the timber, then looked down at the ground. Benteen took one look at Reno's shattered force and knew there would be no offensive, no grand push toward the village. This had turned into something else. This was about survival now, holding ground, buying time, hoping still that Custer was somewhere nearby. But Custer wasn't nearby, and no one was coming down that bluff to rescue them. So they started digging. The bluffs became their shelter, their fort, their last hope. A rough ring of rifle pits scraped into the dry earth, canteens emptied into mouths already cracked with thirst. Wounded men were laid in the center, eyes fluttering open only when the pain returned. Some never opened their eyes again. The sun didn't care. It just kept climbing. They waited. The bluffs offered visibility, but not control. Every movement below, every flicker of motion in the grass could be the start of another assault. Warriors had faded back for now, but only for now. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And then the first shots rang out again. From the east, then the north. Skirmishes, probes. A flash of movement through the tall grass. A shout, a return volley. Then quiet again. The attackers didn't charge like before. This was slower, smarter, testing their defenses, a new game, a different kind of war. Inside the ring, the soldiers crouched lower. They had high ground, yes, but they were exposed. There were no trees, no walls, just dry ridges, shallow ditches, and the will to stay alive. Benteen moved between positions, checking each man, giving orders with a voice roughened by dust. Reno stayed mostly silent, his eyes fixed somewhere far away, reliving a battle that hadn't ended for him yet. They sent runners, messages, hoping someone out there, anyone, had seen Custer, had made contact, had orders, but nothing came back. Just the sound of gunfire, always distant, never closer, like a heartbeat that refused to fade, but also never arrived. They still didn't know, still didn't understand what had happened beyond the next ridge. By late afternoon, water became more valuable than bullets. Canteens passed hand to hand. Some men held them up to their lips only to find them dry. A few volunteers crept down the ravines under cover of darkness, seeking out a muddy trickle of a stream. Some made it back. Others didn't. The wounded begged for water that wasn't there. The surgeons did what they could. A knife here, a stitch there. Sometimes only silence. Flies buzzed in and out of the makeshift perimeter. Horses lay where they'd fallen, too many to bury, too dangerous to move. Still the men held. Still the warriors circled. Through it all, the hope clung to one name. Custer. He was out there. He had to be. That was the plan, wasn't it? Reno hits from one side, Custer flanks from the other. He was supposed to come crashing in, to smash the village, to finish what had been started. But the smoke they saw on the horizon didn't come closer. It just hung there. Men took turns sleeping in short bursts, rifles across their chests, heads on bedrolls that felt like stone. Even in sleep, their muscles twitched, their breath caught. Time bled together. 1 hour felt like 3, then 6. By morning, the ring was still unbroken, but thinner. A few more bodies covered by jackets, a few more canteens turned upside down. Another day under the same sun. Benteen ordered stronger defenses. He knew now. They weren't holding out until reinforcement. They were just holding out. The warriors never charged in force again, not like they had with Reno. They didn't need to. Time and fear did the work for them. Every shot they fired from the ridges, every movement in the shadows, each was a reminder that the soldiers weren't in control. Not anymore. The land belonged to others. The fight had shifted, and so had the meaning of survival. It wasn't about victory. It was about waiting long enough to leave. The soldiers didn't talk much. Voices had grown hoarse. Words felt heavy. They sat in their shallow holes and watched the ridges. They stared across the river toward the village, still standing, still proud, still unbroken. No one had run. No one had fled. The ones who had attacked that first day, men confident in their numbers, in their training, now waited like ghosts above a battlefield that hadn't yet buried them. Custer's name was still whispered, but softer now. Not in anger, not even in hope, in wonder. Where was he? What happened? Why hadn't they heard from him? Eventually the truth would come. But not today. Today the bluff still held. The air still burned. And somewhere out there beyond the haze, the fate of the 7th Cavalry had already been decided. The men didn't know it yet. But history had already turned. It didn't happen all at once. It built slowly, like a storm tightening its grip around the horizon. Custer's column moved north, skirting the bluffs, unaware that what lay ahead was not a skirmish, not a small village of scattered warriors, but a nation awakened, an entire people ready to defend the heartbeat of their world. When he split from Reno, the plan still lived in his mind. Surprise them, flank them, shatter the resistance before it had time to breathe. It was bold, fast, and full of confidence. But the earth had different ideas. The land stretched wide and open, and every step Custer took pulled him deeper into a shape he couldn't see, a circle tightening around him. He reached the ridgeline expecting advantage, but what he found instead were warriors. Hundreds of them, then thousands, some on horseback, some running through the grass like shadows, spears in hand, rifles raised, eyes locked. There was no time to retreat, no ridge to fall back behind, no help from Reno, no signal from Benteen. There was just this patch of high ground, dry and dusty, where they stopped their horses, raised their rifles, and turned to face the end. The warriors didn't charge all at once. They came in waves, each stronger than the last. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, all moving as one, a tide that could not be held back. Custer's men fired fast. They formed tight clusters on the hills. Shots rang out, dust lifted, horses screamed, but the circle kept closing. There were no fortifications, no trees, no cover, just mounds of dry grass, scattered rocks, and the last bullets in their belts. Each man had his own battle. Some reloaded again and again until the heat burned their hands. Some turned their rifles into clubs. Others clutched at nothing when their weapons were gone. A few tried to run. They didn't get far. From a distance, the fight looked like chaos, dust and smoke and bodies weaving through one another. But up close, it had a rhythm, a slow, deadly drumbeat. Movement, fire, retreat, surround, advance, finish. No one can say who fell first. Some believe it was the youngest. Too brave, too fast, too eager. Others think it was the scouts, men who had seen too much, now seeing the end up close. But no one really knows. Not who fell first, not who fired last, not even who stood beside Custer when the final breath left him. What they do know is this: no man escaped. On that hill, surrounded by thunder and dust, the 7th Cavalry's advance unit vanished. When it was over, the ground stopped shaking, but the silence that followed was louder than anything that had come before. The warriors stood still. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout. They looked around and saw what they had done, what had been necessary, what had cost them too. The dust began to settle. Some wandered the field in quiet, some gathered weapons, others looked to the horizon, waiting for the next fight that might come. The sky was unchanged, but the land had shifted. A legend had been born, not of victory, not of triumph, but of silence. The silence after the last breath. The silence after the last shot. When the other soldiers finally arrived days later, they found the hill the way time had left it. Bodies in clusters, horses in heaps, rifles still clutched in broken hands. And Custer. No one could say with certainty where he fell. His uniform stripped, his face quiet. A general now turned into a symbol, but of what exactly no one agreed. Was he a hero? A fool? A warning? The land offered no answers. Only the wind moved now, brushing against the dry grass that had once hidden warriors and carried bullets. The mystery hung in the air even as the facts hardened. Here was a man who had once believed in destiny, who thought the thunder of his horse would echo across the plains forever. But destiny hadn't waited. It had circled him, quietly, patiently, until there was no circle left to escape. The stories that would come after changed with the teller. Some said it was over in minutes. Others swore it stretched for an hour. But in the end, there was no cavalry bugle, no final charge, no rescue from the ridge. Just a hill, just dust, just silence. And scattered across that slope were the last men of a column that had ridden in with songs on their lips and left behind only echoes. The wind carried no secrets that day, only the quiet. A quiet broken only by the slow crunch of feet, the low murmur of prayers, and the realization that this would not be remembered as a victory or a defeat. It would be remembered as something else, an ending, the kind that rewrites everything that came before. Custer had come to make history. Instead, he became it. And the bluffs, the valley, the river, they remembered. They always would. The dust hadn't even settled when the weight of it all came crashing down. All around the valley, the echoes of gunfire faded into nothing. The shouting was gone. The clash of metal, the pounding of hooves, the rhythm of battle, all of it replaced by stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't bring peace. The warriors stood in the soft grass of the valley, surrounded by the silence of what they had done. Victory, yes, but not the kind that lifted hearts, not the kind that filled chests with pride. This was the kind of victory that took more than it gave. The kind that stains the ground and lingers in the soul. Across the river, the village still stood, but it did not cheer. There were no drums, no triumphant cries, only quiet, only mourning. Because while the soldiers had fallen, so had brothers, fathers, sons. The cost was shared, the pain ran both ways. Many warriors didn't return. Those who did bore not only the blood of battle, but the knowledge of what would follow. The world wouldn't let them keep this valley. It wouldn't let them keep this moment. They had won the day, but they all knew it had opened the door to a season of sorrow. Even as they gathered the wounded, even as they tended to their dead, they could feel it. In the wind, in the shifting eyes of the elders, in the way no one spoke too loudly. There was no time to rest. The campfires burned lower, cooking stopped, horses were brought in close, mothers held their children tighter, the young watched the sky as if waiting for it to turn. And in the center of it all, the elders stood in a quiet circle. There were no orders shouted, no war cries raised, just quiet discussions, low voices, the soft rhythm of grief and duty sharing the same breath. The decision was clear. They would leave. Not because they were afraid, not because they had lost, but because they knew how this story always played out when told by someone else. So they began the slow work of breaking the camp. Teepees taken down one by one, fires smothered with care, belongings wrapped tightly tied to horses lifted in bundles. It wasn't panic, it wasn't haste. It was something else, a solemn, practiced kind of sorrow, a knowing grief. Children helped where they could, eyes wide and quiet. Women moved with the grace of those who had done this too many times before. Men stood as lookouts, eyes scanning the ridges, watching the sky. And above them, the wind moved slowly, carrying with it the scent of ash and wildflowers, of gunpowder and sweat, of blood and burned dreams. There was no victory feast, no dancing, no celebration. There were songs, but they weren't for winning. They were for remembering. Low and ancient. Songs sung through tears. Songs meant for the ones who wouldn't ride again. Songs that marked the end of a moment and the beginning of something darker. Some warriors stayed behind a little longer, walking the battlefield once more. They didn't linger over Custer. They didn't speak his name. They weren't there for him. They came for their own, to gather what could be carried, to say the words that needed to be spoken, to leave nothing behind that the wind might forget. The land would remember, that much was certain. But the world beyond this valley, it would twist this day into something else entirely. The warriors knew that too. They had seen it before, how truths became tales, how stories bent in the mouths of strangers, how the ones who came with rifles also came with pens, and those pens could be sharper. So even as they walked away from victory, they walked toward myth. A myth they wouldn't control. They didn't have to, because they weren't fighting for glory or legend or revenge. They had fought because the village was there, because their children were there, because they had no other choice. And now that it was done, they carried that knowledge with them, heavier than any rifle, deeper than any wound. Behind them, the smoke from the last fires drifted upward in thin ribbons, dissolving into the sky. Before them, the open plains stretched wide, promising safety, but never offering it. The trail ahead wasn't marked on any map, but they knew where it led. To more soldiers, more battles, more orders signed in faraway places, more punishment handed down for daring to exist without permission. But for now, they moved together, a people still whole though scarred. As they rode away, the valley behind them held more than just the dead. It held the truth of what had happened here, something deeper than tactics, more human than headlines. It was a sacred moment, one the outside world would reduce to statistics, one history books would cage in dates and ranks. But here in the heart of those who lived it, it remained raw, powerful, real. The smell of earth after fire, the sound of a mother's mourning, the way a young warrior still looked over his shoulder, wondering what kind of world would rise after this one burned. Smoke trailed behind them like a veil, a signal not of triumph but of transition. They had faced the storm and survived it, but storms have eyes, and the worst sometimes waits on the other side. Still they moved, not fast, not loud, just forward, because to stay was to invite ruin. To leave was to protect what remained. And so, with every step, they carried what couldn't be buried, the grief, the warning, the memory. And far behind in the valley where history would hang its myths, the silence returned. Only the wind remained, and it carried the last song out of the village, over the river, past the bluffs, and into a future none of them asked for, but all of them would face. Together. Long after the smoke faded and the ground hardened over the fallen, the voices remained. Whispers at first, then stories, then legends. They came from the survivors, the scouts, the elders, the children who grew up hearing it around fires, each one carrying a fragment of what happened on that ridge, in that valley, on that day when time seemed to stop and then shatter. No single voice could hold it all. It was too large, too complex, too sacred. Instead, the truth emerged in layers. One warrior remembers the dust, thick, choking, clinging to skin and eyes. He saw the soldiers dismount, scatter, reform, fall. He remembers the heat, the breath of his horse, the rhythm of his bow, and the way silence fell when it was over, heavy, permanent. Another voice, softer, older, remembers from the village. The women who waited, the children told to stay close, the distant thunder of guns, the fear of what might return from the hills, or what might not. And in the space between the gunshots and the morning came those who stood somewhere in the middle, the scouts. Crow and Arikara men riding ahead of the column, watching the land for signs of danger, knowing all too well the people they were being sent to face. Some had friends in the village, others had old griefs, but none were ready for what they saw. They watched the line break. They watched Custer ride toward his end. They saw flashes of blue coats swallowed by the dust. And they saw, with eyes that couldn't look away, the moment when everything fell apart. They did not tell these stories easily. Some never told them at all. But others spoke slowly, carefully, and those words were carried forward, passed down not as boasts, but as burdens, pieces of memory held in fragile balance. Some spoke of horses that screamed before falling, of men who threw away weapons and ran toward nowhere, of warriors who hesitated even then before delivering the final blow, not because they pitied the soldiers, but because they knew what would follow. Ghost stories rose from those hills, voices heard at night, hooves thundering across the sky when no horses were near, shapes moving across ridgelines where no warrior stood. Some say Custer still rides, others say he weeps. But the ghosts are not just his. They belong to everyone who spilled blood there, everyone who left part of themselves behind. And for those who survived, native and soldier alike, the hardest part came after. The questions, the blame, the shame, the twisting of what had been real into something simpler, cleaner, easier to teach. But nothing about that day was simple. One account says the soldiers made a final stand in a circle. Another claims they broke and scattered. Some say Custer died early. Others insist he lived to the last shot. Every version swears it's the truth. But truth in battle isn't a single thread. It's a tangle, a storm of memory, pride, fear, and loss. And memory itself is a fragile thing. Years pass. Stories shift. A detail added here, a name lost there. What remains is not one story but a mosaic. A warrior speaks of his brother falling beside him, and the way the sun never looked the same after that. A woman remembers searching the battlefield for her husband's belongings, only to find nothing but silence. A scout describes the way Custer looked just before riding off, and the way he never looked back. And somewhere in a cabin far from the plains, an old soldier wakes up from dreams he can't explain, his hands shaking, heart pounding, as if the battle had never ended. There's a reason this story has never settled. It doesn't want to. It resists being boxed in, resists being wrapped up with a single explanation. Because it wasn't just a battle. It was a collision of worlds. One side fighting to preserve its future, the other blindly chasing an illusion of control. And caught in between were the people no one asked about. The scouts, the women, the children, the wounded. They all saw pieces of it. And their stories, raw and uneven, hold more truth than any official account ever could. Some tell it in song, others in silence. A few speak of dreams, visions of riders lost in fog, of arrows that fly backward, of rivers that run red and never stop. They don't ask to be believed. They only ask to be remembered, because the land remembers. The wind that moves through the grass still knows the names. And sometimes, when everything is quiet, the bluffs echo with footsteps not yet faded. A hoofbeat, a cry, a breath. Not imagination, just memory, refusing to die. And that's the heart of it. The voices that linger aren't just telling what happened. They're asking what it meant, what it still means. A boy who heard his grandfather's version by firelight may grow up to tell a different version to his own child, not to change the truth, but to keep it alive. Because truth in stories like this isn't static. It's living. It grows with each voice that carries it forward. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit we don't know everything. That the hill where Custer fell holds more than bones. It holds contradiction, pain, pride, 100 unspoken thoughts buried in the dust. In the end, all we have are the voices, not one, but many, braided together like strands of grass on the plains, holding the weight of a story too large for any single telling. But still told. Before the blood had dried on the grass, the story was already changing. Not out on the plains, but far away in cities where the sun still rose over cobbled streets and newsboys ran with headlines in hand. By the time the truth limped back from the battlefield, the myth had already galloped ahead of it. Custer was dead. That was all it took. Just 3 words, and the machine began to turn. Within hours, printing presses roared to life. Artists who'd never seen the Little Bighorn picked up their brushes. Editors sharpened their pens. They didn't wait for survivor accounts. They didn't wait for the facts. They had a narrative to craft, and it would be heroic. They didn't see chaos. They didn't see a shattered command or an arrogant blunder. They saw martyrdom. They painted Custer in full uniform, sword raised, surrounded by hundreds, eyes blazing to the last breath. He looked defiant, noble, untouched by fear, a general fighting for his nation, not a lieutenant colonel who'd underestimated his enemy. The battlefield turned into a stage, and the East watched with rapt attention. They didn't hear the screams or see the confusion. They didn't feel the heat or smell the blood. They saw oil paintings in gilded frames. They saw articles with bold titles and confident conclusions. The Last Stand became theater, a national opera of sacrifice. And just like that, defeat transformed into destiny. The American press did not mourn the loss. They polished it, framed it, hung it on the wall of history like a trophy. Custer's mistakes were buried beneath thick layers of ink and imagination. He was not a man who ignored warnings or divided his command. He was a fallen hero, and with every paper sold, the truth took another step backward. In the cities, his name echoed like a trumpet. Custer the brave, Custer the avenger, Custer standing tall as his men fell around him. The myth moved faster than the truth ever could, because the myth was easy, clean, marketable. The truth was complicated, but no one wanted complicated. So they made statues. They wrote poems. They told children bedtime stories about a man who never surrendered. And slowly, steadily, the country began to believe them. Even those who knew better. Even those who'd fought beside him or watched from a distance and survived found themselves swallowed by the flood of fiction. It wasn't just a lie. It was a choice. A decision to reshape history before it settled into memory. Custer didn't ask for sainthood. But sainthood came anyway, wrapped in flags, crowned in sorrow, carved into marble. And once the carving began, it was nearly impossible to stop. No one wanted to talk about the mistakes. No one wanted to talk about the scouts who warned him. No one wanted to hear about the villages he burned or the battles he chose when peace was still possible. Those parts didn't fit the painting, so they vanished. Meanwhile, schoolbooks filled with the other version, the one with glory, the one with courage, the one with a man standing alone against an unstoppable tide, not because he was reckless, but because he was righteous. The painting became the memory, and the memory became the myth. Custer's family leaned into it. His widow Libby traveled and wrote and spoke, shaping her husband's legacy like clay. She made him immortal, untouchable, and the public thanked her for it. By the time the army conducted full reports, few were reading them. The version in the newspapers had already cemented itself. Ink had done what bullets couldn't. It had turned defeat into triumph. There were those who questioned it. There were whispers. Accounts that didn't line up, questions no one wanted to answer. But they were drowned out. Because the myth was louder, more convenient. And that's what stuck. That's what made it into paintings, into history textbooks, into the minds of generations who grew up hearing only one version of what happened that summer day by the river. It wasn't just a story. It was a tool, a way to justify expansion, to valorize violence, to mask failure with romanticism. The Last Stand wasn't just Custer's, it became America's. An allegory, a symbol, a clean ending in a land full of complicated beginnings. No one drew the women fleeing, or the children hiding, or the warriors mourning after the dust settled. Those images didn't sell, so they didn't exist. And so the legend hardened, first into art, then into textbooks, then into memory, until even those who stood on that field began to doubt their own recollections. Was it really that chaotic? Did Custer really fall early? Was there really no plan? The questions faded. The myth stayed. But behind every painting, every headline, every bronze statue, the real story waited quieter, heavier, and far less flattering. It whispered from the journals that weren't reprinted, from the survivors who weren't interviewed, from the native accounts dismissed as folklore. It reminded anyone who'd listened that history doesn't need heroes, it needs honesty. That myths are beautiful but dangerous, because once a nation believes in a story it prefers over the truth, it stops asking what really happened, and starts repeating what didn't. That's the power of a myth. It buries not just the truth, but the lessons it carried. And so the painting remained, framed, untouched, glorious. A man with golden hair, sword lifted, enemies surrounding him, as if the world itself had paused to admire his courage. But if you look closely, the sky in that painting is too clean, the men too orderly, the ground too calm. Because real battles don't look like that. They look like confusion, like panic, like sweat and dust and regret. But none of that made the final cut. Instead, what endured was the version we wanted. A final stand, a noble fall, a nation united in grief. Even if none of it was true. Because in the East, it became a painting before it ever became a fact. She could have disappeared. After the gunfire stopped and the headlines faded, after the widows received their telegrams and the nation turned the page, Libby Custer could have done what society expected. Mourned quietly, worn black, faded into history as just another wife left behind by war. But she didn't. Because Libby didn't see herself as a footnote, she saw herself as the final chapter. Her grief didn't hollow her, it sharpened her, and in that sharpening, she found a purpose. She became the author of a war, not the one fought on horseback, but the one fought in memory, a war over legacy, over what people would believe, long after the guns had fallen silent. She picked up her pen, and she rewrote everything. From the moment news of Custer's death reached her, Libby knew the story would not tell itself. Or worse, it would be told by those who didn't know him, Those who would focus on the disaster, the miscalculations, the loss. She couldn't stop the loss, but she could shape the aftermath. And so she did. She didn't waste time. Within months, she began writing. First, it was letters. Then it was articles. Then it was books. Page after page, she painted her husband in the light he never lived long enough to defend, the brave soldier, the devoted leader, the misunderstood martyr. She built a narrative not out of reports or testimonies, but from love and determination. She toured cities. She gave lectures. She sat for interviews in grand hotel lobbies, dressed in mourning, her eyes steady. She wasn't just retelling a life, she was branding it. Custer wasn't just her husband. He became her mission. She learned how to read a crowd, how to tilt a memory just enough to soften its edges, how to bury controversy beneath charm. She didn't argue with critics. She outlasted them. And as the years passed, the story hardened. It calcified into something larger than both of them. There were other widows from the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Many mourned in silence. Libby mourned in ink. She made sure his name never left the public imagination, not through force, but through presence, a constant voice, a gentle pressure, a reminder in every publication that this man, her man, was more than a military failure. He was a symbol. The truth became more malleable under her hands, flexible, adaptable. She wasn't lying. She was curating, sifting through her life and choosing what to keep, what to emphasize, what to let fade into dust. The man who rode too fast, who ignored warnings, who made critical errors, he faded. The man who died for his men, who stood unshaken in the face of death, he remained. And the public welcomed it. They didn't want a flawed hero. They wanted a legend. Libby gave them one, and they rewarded her for it. Books sold, lecture halls filled, articles reprinted her words without questioning the angle, because her grief was real, her loss was tangible, and grief is persuasive, more persuasive sometimes than facts. She understood that mourning had weight, that love could move people in ways logic never could. She used that not cynically, but strategically. Because for Libby, this wasn't manipulation. It was devotion. It wasn't a career. It was survival. If she didn't tell the story, who would? If she didn't protect his legacy, what would be left? A cautionary tale. An embarrassment? A name muttered, not remembered. Not if she had anything to say about it. And she always had something to say. She became a fixture, not just of memory, but of history itself. A quiet architect of how the country remembered one of its most controversial battles, not by force, but by being there, speaking, writing, reminding, again and again and again. She outlived her husband by decades, saw the century change, watched new wars rise and fall, but she never stopped her campaign. Every speech was another stone in the monument, every page another brick in the wall of myth. She didn't need to shout. Her consistency was power enough. And in the end, it worked. It more than worked. Custer's name became legend. His last stand became heroic. And Libby's name, though often quieter, stood behind it all, the hand that held the pen, the voice behind the myth. There were those who questioned her version, who pointed to facts, contradictions, military reports. But they were met not with rebuttals, just a deeper silence. Because you can't argue with emotion. You can't fact-check a feeling. Libby didn't try to convince people with footnotes. She convinced them with love. And love lingers. It sticks to the story like glue. It softens hard truths, blurs sharp corners, makes even the darkest endings feel noble. She never remarried, never distanced herself from his shadow. She lived inside it, by choice, because to let go of the story would be to lose him again. So she held on, not just to the memory, but to the reins of the narrative itself. It wasn't just history, it was hers. And when she finally passed, after a lifetime of reshaping legacy, She left behind more than writings. She left a nation that remembered Custer not as he was, but as she wanted him to be. That's the power of a single voice, steady and persistent. The power of love turned to labor. Grief turned to authorship. One woman with no military rank, no battlefield medals, no command yet, somehow she directed how the entire country would understand a war. Not by force, but by telling a better story. And telling it louder, and telling it longer, and never, ever letting it go. In the end, Libby Custer didn't just survive the war. She rewrote it. The dust had barely settled at Little Bighorn when the retaliation began. The war wasn't over, not even close. It had only changed its shape. The battle may have been a victory for the Lakota and their allies, but it came with a cost they couldn't see yet, but could already feel in the silence that followed. Because somewhere far from the valley, maps were being redrawn. Telegraphs clicked across the wires, orders were signed, supplies were packed, trains readied, and the U.S. Army began to move. Not one regiment, not two, but a flood. Thousands of troops spilling into the plains like a river after a storm. What had once been a frontier was now a theater of vengeance. Retaliation would not be subtle. It would be swift and overwhelming. Custer's death had shocked the nation, but what followed shocked the tribes. This wasn't justice. This was retribution. It came with new forts, with wagon trails guarded by soldiers, with orders to hunt down the leaders of resistance and bring them in, dead or surrendered. The Lakota had been fighting to protect their homes, their way of life. But now the battle was no longer about one ridge, one river, or one general. Now it was about survival itself. Crazy Horse knew this. He had seen what war did, how it never really ended, only returned in new forms. Still, he chose to keep fighting. Not out of stubbornness, but because there was no other path. He refused to abandon what his ancestors had passed down. But even he could feel it shifting. The land felt tighter, the space to move, to hunt, to breathe. It was closing in. By 1877, Crazy Horse had surrendered, not in defeat, but because there were no more options, no more room to run. The war had backed them into a corner, and the walls were built of policy and barbed wire. Sitting Bull took a different path, north, into Canada, across a border that to his people had never existed until someone else drew it. He sought refuge in a place untouched by Washington's promises and punishments. But even that wasn't safe for long. Winter was cruel, supplies were scarce, and Ottawa's patience was thinner than its frontier. In time, even Canada became inhospitable. And Sitting Bull returned, not because he trusted the United States, but because exile is a lonely road. The war had never been just about weapons. It was about time, resources, endurance. And the U.S. had more of all three. The buffalo, once covering the plains in a dark, moving tide, were almost gone. Not by accident, but by strategy. Kill the buffalo, and you starve the resistance. Remove the heartbeat of the culture, and you silence the drum. Children were taken from their families, sent to schools where their language was banned, their hair was cut, and their memories scrubbed clean. Villages once defined by freedom were now marked by boundaries and surveillance. The reservation system wasn't peace. It was containment. Each treaty, each order, each bureaucratic word disguised a deeper violence, a forced stillness, a silencing of motion and spirit. The ghost of Little Bighorn didn't disappear. It followed every wagon that crossed the plains. It lingered in the barbed fences, in the church bells ringing over lands once sacred, in the rustle of treaty papers that spoke of promises and delivered erasure. The victory at Little Bighorn had been real, but so was the price. What the Lakota won in one summer, they began to lose over many winters. And yet, the memory remained. It echoed in songs passed down quietly, in stories told in corners away from officials' ears, in the look between grandparents and grandchildren when someone spoke of Custer's name. The battlefield had changed, but the resistance lived on. In identity, in language, in ceremony. The U.S. military might have flooded the plains, but they could not drown the roots of a people. And while the headlines of the East spoke of pacification, of civilizing missions, on the ground it felt more like a smothering, a slow, grinding undoing of generations. Every fire doused, every path blocked, every river crossed under someone else's flag. Still, the people remembered. Remembered how the land once felt without fences, how the stars were once navigated without borders, how the wind spoke in a language that didn't need translation. And that remembering, quiet as it was, became its own rebellion. The name Little Bighorn was written into American textbooks as a last stand. A dramatic footnote, but for the Lakota, for the Northern Cheyenne, for the Arapaho, it was something else entirely. It was proof. Proof that power could be pushed back, even if only for a moment. Proof that bravery wasn't defined by the size of an army, but by what you stood for when you had nothing left to lose. That valley where the battle was fought became a scar, but scars are not weaknesses. They are records. Reminders of Bighorn were not only the warriors who rode away. They were the children born in the years that followed. Children who were told not to speak their names in their own tongue, who were taught to forget who they were, but didn't. They remembered. Because some truths refused to be buried, not by armies, not by time. So the war didn't end at Little Bighorn. It stretched onward, not always with rifles and riders, but with memory and movement, with names reclaimed, lands reclaimed, voices returned, and the ghost of that battle, the one the U.S. tried to rewrite or contain, lives still, not in museums, but in blood, in bone, in breath. There's a quiet now. Not silence, but a quiet. The kind that wraps around your shoulders when you step onto a place that remembers too much. The wind moves differently here, not louder, not softer, just heavier, like it's carrying voices you can't quite hear, but you feel. This is the Little Bighorn battlefield today, where once horses charged and rifles cracked, where warriors sang and soldiers fell. Now you'll see tourists, families with cameras, school groups with maps, people in sun hats standing where men once died. There are signs and paved paths, informational boards planted in the earth like modern campfires for storytelling. And standing tall, watching over the ridge, the white marble markers, each one where a soldier fell, clean, straight, bright against the yellow grass. But move farther, not just with your feet, but with your attention. Look for the red ones. Not as many, smaller, rougher. Their names, if known, are etched into stone, not as a declaration, but a preservation. These are the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, warriors who stood their ground on their own land and paid for it. It wasn't always like this. For decades, the story told here wore one face, the face of defeat and redemption, of Custer the brave, of duty and sacrifice, a version carved by those who won the narrative war, even if they lost the battle. The battlefield became a monument early on, but not to the people who had defended their homes. It became a monument to the fallen soldiers, their version of the story. It wasn't until much later, much too late, that the other side was allowed to speak. That the land itself was seen as more than a canvas for American memory. Because this ground wasn't just a place where something ended. It was also where something resisted. And now, slowly, carefully, respectfully, that fuller truth is being honored. Tribal guides walk visitors through the land, not with scripts, but with stories. Stories passed down. Stories that don't need validation from textbooks. Stories rooted in blood and sky and grass. They speak not just of tactics and timelines, but of ancestors, of families, of what it means to fight for something larger than yourself, and what it costs. The monument was renamed long after it should have been, no longer just the Custer battlefield. Now it carries the name of both, Little Bighorn, a shift that seems small, but names matter. Names reclaim space. This is not just a war memorial. It's a crossroads of memory. It's where history and grief walk side by side, where every gust of wind might be carrying a prayer. You might see a child walking beside their grandmother, being told the real version of the story, one that won't be in their school book, one that doesn't begin with Custer, but with treaties broken, buffalo lost, and the long fight to simply remain. There's power in that, because this battlefield isn't just soil and stone. It's a place that pushes back against forgetting. The red markers stand quietly, but they speak loudly to those who know how to listen. Each one says, "We were here, we mattered, we fought." The grass still grows, the sky still opens wide above the hills, but now finally the stories being told on this land belong to more than one voice. There are ceremonies here now, memorial runs, gatherings of descendants. These aren't reenactments, they're reckonings. Not nostalgia, but renewal, a reminder that the past isn't done with us yet. It lingers, in the soil, in the air, in the hearts of those who come not just to learn, but to mourn. Because mourning doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it's a hand resting on a stone, sometimes it's silence among tall grass. Sometimes it's a long drive just to stand in a place that meant everything to people the textbooks forgot. And the land remembers. It doesn't forget the hoofbeats or the smoke. It doesn't forget the fear. It doesn't forget the songs. Stand at the crest where the last stand happened and look down. You're not just looking at geography. You're looking at gravity, at the weight of history that never quite settled. There's a reason people return here. Not just out of curiosity, but out of something deeper, a need to stand on ground that carries more than memory, ground that carries meaning. Not all places do that. Some places move on. This one never did. It holds on, not with vengeance, but with truth. And truth, when left alone long enough, becomes sacred. The battlefield is many things now, a classroom, a monument, a sacred site, a place where you can see what happens when two worlds collide, and what rises from the collision. You don't need to know every name to feel it. You don't need to recite the dates. You just have to stand still for a moment and listen, because the wind here doesn't whisper, it remembers, and it hopes that you will too. The guns have long since gone quiet, the smoke has faded, the bodies have returned to dust, but some stories never really end. They drift, they echo, they settle into the bones of the land and the breath of the sky. The Little Bighorn River still flows. It curves and bends like a memory that won't straighten out, like a story told around a fire, always shifting in shape but never losing its core. It saw it all, the screams, the thunder of hooves, the silence afterward, and it sees us now too, watching, wondering, walking paths once painted in blood. Time moved on, but the land didn't forget. Neither did the stars. The same constellations that shone over that brutal day still hang above the valley, still watching, still glowing cold light onto warm ground. They were here before the first footstep. They were here when the first arrow was loosed. They were here when the last rifle jammed. And they remain now, bearing witness in their own quiet way. Names were left behind, etched in stone, recited in classrooms, debated in books. Custer, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, figures too large to hold in your hand, too complex to fit neatly into pages. They're symbols now. For some they mean glory, for others survival, for many they mean pain. But before the statues and the textbooks, they were just men. Men with fears, with flaws, with fire in their hearts and futures in their hands, and all of them, no matter the uniform, no matter the banner, were pulled into something bigger than themselves. Some sought it, some resisted it, but all were claimed by it. The story became history, and then it became legend. And legends are funny things. They grow roots, but also wings. They get heavier with time, but easier to carry. Until one day we forget what was real and what was remembered. But the stars don't confuse the two. They know what they saw. They remember the children left behind, the mothers who waited, the campfires that burned a little lower the night after, the prayers said into empty sky, the grief that never made it into any report. They remember the horses that didn't come back, the brothers who didn't wake, the songs that were never sung again. Because what was lost at Little Bighorn wasn't just lives. It was a way of being, a world built on balance and memory and motion, a world that didn't need fences to define it, a world that knew how to listen to rivers and respect storms. That world began to crumble that day, not because of one battle, but because of what the battle represented. The end of negotiation, the beginning of containment, the long, slow unraveling of a people's right to live without permission. But even as that world faded from maps and treaties and headlines, it stayed alive in other places, in the language spoken softly in kitchens, in the beadwork passed from hand to hand, in the drums that still echo under stars that still shine. Because some things survive by hiding, others by fighting, and others still by simply refusing to be forgotten. You can visit the battlefield, you can read the plaques and stand on the ridges and try to picture the chaos, but the full story, that's harder. It's too large, too layered, too soaked in sorrow and contradiction. You can't map it. You can't teach it in a single lesson. But maybe you can feel it, in the wind that moves just a little differently, in the hush that falls when no one's speaking, in the way the land seems to lean in, waiting, hoping you'll notice. The people who died here didn't get to choose what came next, but we do. We choose how we remember, what we honor, what we question, what we carry forward. Some will keep telling the story of a doomed charge, of a tragic loss, of bravery on all sides, and that's part of it, but not the whole. Others will tell of resistance, of defiance, of a final victory before the long dark night, and that too is true, but still not complete. Because the truth doesn't live in one version. It lives in the spaces between them, in the contradictions, in the silences, in the things that can never be fully known but should always be felt, like the fear in a young warrior's chest, or the desperation in a cavalryman's prayer, or the moment when the first shot cracked through morning stillness. We weren't there, but the stars were, and the stars remember. They remember the dust rising, the banners falling, the elders whispering even as the world around them changed. And now, after all this time, the dust has settled, not forgotten, never that, but settled, like grief that's learned how to live inside the chest without breaking it, like truth that doesn't need to shout anymore because it knows it's still there. So we listen, we walk softly, we look up. And maybe we don't understand everything. Maybe we never will. But we know enough to know that something sacred happened here, something violent, something complicated, something that echoes still, not in words, but in wind and stars and earth. The world changed at Little Bighorn. But not all of it ended. Some of it just went quiet. Some of it just waited. And some of it still speaks. To those who pause. To those who care. To those who are willing to hear what cannot be told. Sleep now, says the wind. Sleep now, says the grass. The battle is over. But the story lives on.